What's going on, guys? It's Jimmy here. So, President Biden has a major warning for Americans here. He warns, quote, the whole world is in trouble if the U.S. defaults on its debt. I'll give you the details. I'll actually let you hear exactly what he says here in a second. President Biden is also considering invoking the 14th Amendment to avoid default, but Republicans, Mitch McConnell, is warning against it. And I'll let you hear what President Biden here has to say in a second. First, here is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer over saying what happened with their meeting when they met with Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, and also Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, revealing an interesting detail here. Take a listen here. Let me know your thoughts.
Yesterday afternoon, I met with President Biden, Speaker McCarthy, Leader McConnell, and Leader Jeffries at the White House to discuss how we can take default off the table while making separate progress on an annual budget. There was bad news and good news coming out of yesterday's White House meeting. The bad news, Speaker McCarthy refused, absolutely refused, to take default off the table. He was the only holdout during yesterday's meeting. President Biden said that no matter what, default should be taken off the table. Leader Jeffries said default is off the table. I committed to taking default off the table. Even Leader McConnell said unequivocally that no matter what, the U.S. will not default. But Speaker McCarthy alone refused to take the threat of catastrophic default off the table. I asked him pointedly if he would join us. But during yesterday's meeting, he was the sole holdout. Instead of taking default off the table, Speaker McCarthy is taking default hostage. If anyone wonders what the biggest problem for avoiding default right now is, it is Speaker McCarthy insisting he'll exploit default to push a hard-right agenda. Speaker McCarthy realizes his hard-right agenda would never become law on its own because the American people are so opposed. So instead, he is holding the country hostage to default. It is dangerous. It is reckless. Avoiding default should not be contingent on passing the GOP's hard-right partisan agenda. And the American people overwhelmingly agree. A recent Washington Post ABC poll found that when Americans were asked if debt limit and federal spending should be handled separately or together, 58% of Americans believe they should be handled separately, just as we are saying, just as President Biden is saying. Only 26% of Americans say they should be linked, as Speaker McCarthy is proposing to do. Even 46% of Republicans said it should be handled separately. A plurality of Republicans, 46 to 40, is against what McCarthy is doing by tying the two together. Americans realize how dangerous this is. So again, avoiding default should not be contingent on passing the GOP's hard-right agenda. Certainly not one that will make drastic cuts to veterans, to health care services, run a buzzsaw through federal law enforcement, and abandon our seniors and working families. What's more, the GOP's extremist bill is riddled with unrelated hard-right policies. It would gut rules for corporations, hollow out environmental law, and cut health care for millions of our nation's most vulnerable. The cherry on top, not much of a cherry, sour cherry. MAGA Republicans want to undo Democrats' marquee legislation to invest in America, advance energy security, and reduce the deficit. That is the agenda Speaker McCarthy believes is worth threatening default. Now, the good news. The good news is that President Biden has asked the four leaders in our teams to sit down and begin talking about where we can agree on budget and appropriations. Our staffs will be having conversations beginning today that are part of the regular appropriations process. Now, Speaker McCarthy will have plenty of say over the budget in the appropriations process. That is the proper place to have these debates, not during conversations about the full faith and credit of the United States.
Now, if you didn't see what Speaker Kevin McCarthy said here, I'll show you that here in a moment. You guys can let me know your thoughts here in the comments section. Here's what President Biden had to say. As you can see here, he just said, or you can see from the headline, the whole world is in trouble if the U.S. defaults on its debt, and we're closer than ever to this. Here's what President Biden has to say.
I thought a productive meeting with the congressional leadership about the path forward to make sure America does not default, emphasize does not default on its debt for the first time in our history. I'm pleased but not surprised to hear Republican Minority Leader of the United States Senate saying that at our meeting that the United States is not going to default, never has, and it never will. He's absolutely correct. We agree to continue our discussions, and we're going to meet again on Friday. In the meantime, our staffs, we're going to meet today and daily between now and then, and everyone in the meeting understood the risk of default. Our economy would fall into a significant recession. It would devastate retirement accounts, increase borrowing costs. According to Moody's, nearly 8 million Americans would lose their jobs, and our international reputation would be damaged in the extreme. The last part is me, international. Moody's did not say the last part about damage in the extreme. I made clear during our meeting that default is not an option. Repeated that time and again. America is not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills, and avoiding default is a basic duty of the United States Congress. In fact, they did it 3 times under my predecessor without not one time creating a crisis, rattling the markets, or undermining the unshakable trust the world has in America's commitment to paying its bills. And I'll remind you, the national debt went up 40% over the 200 years. It went up 40% under my predecessor. And that's the problem we're dealing with today. I might note parenthetically, in my first 2 years, I reduced the debt by $1.7 trillion. No president's ever done that. I told congressional leaders that I'm prepared to begin a separate discussion about my budget and the spending priorities, but not under the threat of default. As I said, I've already cut the deficit by $1.7 trillion in my first 2 years in office, and the budget just submitted to Congress cuts another $3 trillion in debt over the next 10 years, my budget that I submitted. I made it clear that we can cut spending and cut the deficit. For example, my budget cuts $200 billion in spending by strengthening Medicare's power to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices. In addition, that's on top of the $160 billion in budget savings we passed last year by being able to reduce the price of insulin and other drugs for those on Medicare. And my budget cuts $30 billion in spending on tax subsidies for big oil companies. They made $200 billion. They don't need a $30 billion subsidy to drill. It makes no sense. Why are we handing them a $30 billion tax subsidy? And, it's time to stop doing that. And that's what my budget does. Among other things, my budget also funds the Internal Revenue Code so that there's enough agents to thoroughly look at the taxes of billionaires in America. This Congressional Budget Office says it would raise $200 billion. Larry Summers, the former secretary, says it'll raise twice that amount. It'll raise a lot of money. Why do they want to get rid of the people who, in fact, would be able to do those audits? And my budget has some of the strongest anti-fraud proposals ever proposed. It strengthens the number of inspector generals. Remember, I know some of you covered me with my arguments in the past with the last administration for cutting inspector generals as to how the money was being spent. And the inspector generals are watchdogs for taxpayers' dollars. And it's been estimated that we'd save $10 for every dollar spent on funding inspector generals. My budget cuts wasteful spending, closes loopholes, and does one more thing. It makes the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations to begin to just start to pay some of their fair share, just some of their fair share. Speaker McCarthy offered a very different way forward. He's proposed deep cuts that I believe are going to hurt American families. Millions of Americans relying on Medicaid for their health care would be at risk of losing that. And there would be 30 million fewer outpatient visits for veterans to the VA hospitals. And we just increased the VA budget so they could accommodate seeing these folks. And we'd have to cut 30,000 law enforcement agents, FBI, DEA, Border Patrol. 100,000 teachers and support personnel would lose their jobs. And all of that would hurt Americans and leave folks behind. Look, now I know the speaker says, well, I'm not, he uses the L word, the lying word, but says I'm not telling the truth. All I asked him inside was, if you're not going to cut any of those programs, and you're saying the cut is 22% across the board, then you're going to have to cut a hell of a lot more with the programs that are left. No, we're not going to do that either. I'm not sure. I don't think they're sure exactly what they're proposing.
Yeah, so you can see here there's two different policies here, the Democratic policy and the Republican policy. Neither of them was going to pass. The Republican policy that was passed in the House only. A lot of people get that confused. You'll hear Kevin McCarthy say, we raised the debt limit, but it's only in the House, so it's not officially raised, because for a bill to pass, it has to pass the House, the Senate, and the president has to sign it. And then you hear you hear Biden say that their budget or their bill would cut the deficit by $3 trillion. It's basically like raising taxes on the wealthy, and raising taxes on corporations, and it's based on what the deficit would be if they were to not enact this new plan. It would cut the deficit by $3 trillion. The Republicans want to cut the deficit by $4.8 trillion, again, compared to if there was no new plan. Okay, this kind of gives you an idea here. Two very different plans enacted in very different ways. Republican plan, Democratic plan. Neither of those plans is going to pass, because the Republicans aren't going to pass the Democrats' plan. The Democrats aren't going to pass the Republicans' plan. They're going to have to come somewhere in the middle. Okay? But that's the problem right now, is that neither of them wants to pass the other's plan. So they have to find some common ground, which they're nowhere close to doing right now. And of course, politics, Congress, they wait till the last minute, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says that they could default by June 1st, which is only 3 weeks away at this point, and they're nowhere close to this happening, okay? Democrats are saying they don't even want to negotiate, that they should just raise the budget without any negotiations, because that's what's been done in the past, and that's what they did for former President Donald Trump 3 times. They raised the deficit, or they raised the debt ceiling 3 times for him, and he raised he spent $8 trillion over the deficit, and they raised the debt ceiling. So, and I get it that that's what happens, but Republicans are using this as leverage to say, we need cuts 22% across the board, and they're going to have to come to some type of agreement, or else we could default. So let me know your thoughts here. I'll keep you up to date here with everything. I'll link you to the video here where Speaker McCarthy speaks, and you can see his side of the story here right now. If you haven't yet, make sure to click the subscribe button down below and the bell icon so you don't miss out on any new videos here on our YouTube channel. It's completely free to do so. New videos come out here every day at 10 a.m., 3 p.m., and 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And thanks for liking and sharing these videos. Here's the video with Kevin McCarthy, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, with his side of the story, basically. Or you can click here to see what's coming for all 50 states, and is a major, major thing happening here today, actually. So click on one of those videos next. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.